Do you see a deal? What percentage do you attach to a deal then? What percentage probability right now?
Yeah, I think it's hard to put an exact percentage on it, but I would say at the moment I think a deal is still looking more likely than not. There are clearly some very tough negotiations going in at the moment, but we can still see sort of the broad outlines of a mutually agreeable nuclear framework. Having said that, there are still some very difficult issues that need to be resolved, and the main one probably being the pace at which sanctions are lifted and also the details of the inspections regime. Essentially, Iran wants to see sanctions lifted more or less immediately, whereas the US probably envisages more of a sort of a gradual lifting in parallel with verification of Iranian compliance.
And how have we got to this? Has this been through compromise driven by political will, just pure political will to get a deal done on both sides?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at both sides, there's clearly a very, very strong need from both the Iranians and the Americans for a deal. If you look at the Iranians, the economic issue is clearly like the main driving factor here. I mean, if you look at the Iranian economy back in 2013, it was really on the ropes. They made some sort of economic adjustments back then, cut public spending, and things started to look a little bit better. So in some ways, sort of easing the pressure on Iran. But then, of course, since then, we've had the oil price slide, which has put pressure on the Iranian economy, and that's been a big factor. On the American side, it's probably more a prestige issue for Obama. This has been his main foreign political objective. And the administration has really struggled in the Middle East for any sort of foreign political successes. So this is really sort of their main target.
One thing that strikes me is that despite the fact that the Iranian economy has been really crushed by the sanctions, that opinion polls that we have suggest that the people are still very much in support of the nuclear program, not necessarily the weaponry, but the nuclear program, and very much blame the Americans, the Europeans, etc., for the crushing impact of the sanctions, which is similar perhaps to in Russia, where the people blame not Putin's decisions over Ukraine, but the Europeans, the Americans, for the impact of the sanctions on their economy. So even when, assuming conditions are lifted, there is an agreement in place, what does that mean for relations between Iraq and particularly America going forward when there's so much blame?
Yeah, well, I think, there's clearly sort of a problem here with distrust and mutual suspicions. And I think initially there was kind of this hope that these negotiations would lead to sort of a rapprochement between the US and Iran, but that's looking increasingly unlikely. I think now the scope of negotiations have become very, very narrow. It's really just boiled down to the nuclear program itself, and any sort of ideas that this might, strengthen more moderate elements in Iran or sort of temper Iran's behavior in the region. I think that's looking increasingly unlikely. And I think, if you look at the Saudi position, then their concern is that this deal could actually make tensions worse. I mean, they are concerned that Iran's role in the region hasn't been part of the negotiations, and that in a sort of a post-sanctions Iran could be emboldened to act much more forcefully in the region.
I was going to ask you about that very point, Torbjorn. How will Iran behave in the region after a deal is done? Does it change anything about how active they are in various regional conflicts? I think about Yemen in particular as one of them.
Yeah, I think Yemen and Syria especially are very good examples. We've seen already in Syria Iran step up its involvement as Bashar al-Assad comes under a stronger pressure. So clearly, I mean, if we're looking at some kind of immediate lifting and freezing of sanctions, then Iran will be given access to dozens of billions of dollars, perhaps more than $100 billion, and it's likely that a significant portion of that will go to sort of foreign political adventures like Yemen and Syria. So I think yes, there is quite a high risk that Iran will feel emboldened to act more forcefully, and they know that the Americans in particular do not want to jeopardize the deal, so they feel that they have a bit more leeway to kind of act a bit more forcefully, and we've seen that in the region recently.
We've seen a number of oil companies talking about either, well, some of them are already doing business there, but or starting to do business there, talking about doing business there. How difficult is that going to be, though, do you think?
I think it will be difficult. I mean, first of all, Iran will clearly be a huge opportunity for foreign oil and gas companies, and it's got the third largest oil and gas reserves in the world, and it could probably start increasing production of crude oil relatively rapidly once sanctions are lifted. Of course, projections will vary depending on how quickly sanctions are lifted and how they are lifted, but if we assume that there is some kind of agreement within the next few weeks and that oil sanctions are gone by the middle of next year, then Wood Mackenzie expects Iran to be able to add around 600,000 barrels per day of crude oil production to global supply by the end of 2017. But as you say, clearly companies would face some pretty significant operational challenges in Iran, if you look at the record of European oil and gas companies during the 2000s, it's not great. They face some very difficult problems. I think probably the main one was, the unattractive fiscal terms which Iran offered to oil and gas companies, and it now appears that they are committed to improving those. We will have to wait and see, but they are in competition with other countries, so they will have to improve that. But even leaving that aside, you also have other problems such as a bloated petroleum bureaucracy, political risks, both regionally and domestically, so huge problems.